Thanks, Ron. So, I'll hope that there's no precedent in the fact that our title here is the same as the title of the last album Brian Eno made before an entire career of elevator music. Here's how we're going to go here. We're taking the Postly obligation quite seriously. We're going to talk about everyone's book. That is, everyone sitting at that end of the U there.
You say every book must go.
Well, not one. No, we certainly won't be saying that. I'm going to do most of the talk, and just towards the end, I'll hand over to James to add a few things. We're going to set this up mainly as in the first place, bit of a dialectic with Michael's book, but then I'm going to digress and seek help in the other books to make some progress on that dialectic, and the dialectic is going to be quite complicated. So I'm going to first ask to what extent there is a disagreement between us and the view, and Michael's version of Neo-Kantianism. I'm going to suggest that there is indeed probably a disagreement, a real disagreement. But it's pretty qualified, and especially when we bring all these other perspectives in, it might become so qualified that it disappears or becomes semantic. And we're then going to shift the dialectic at the end, and James is going to say, well, suppose we minimize that disagreement. How could we recast some of the positive metaphysical themes coming out of our book in Michael's terms? So that dialectic has sort of two parts to it. So I won't do any more framing, I'll just go into it. So the title of our conference, as you know, is Does Scientific Naturalism Exclude Metaphysics? And I want to contrast our answer to that question with one interpretation of what would be Michael's answer to that question. I'm using naturalism here in a broader sense than Quinean naturalistic epistemology. By the contrast class with scientific naturalism, as we'll be understanding it here, is analytic metaphysics, a priori metaphysics. So any metaphysics that is inspired by science, and indeed thinks it must stay strictly tethered to the actual contents of science, that's what we mean by naturalism. So then if we ask the question, does that kind of naturalism exclude all metaphysics, as opposed to just the kind of analytic metaphysics that doesn't have any fans among the speakers here? Then, as was made nicely clear in Michael's answer just now to Paul's question, Michael's answer is yes, it does. Right? You shouldn't do metaphysics if you are a scientist, if you're doing scientific philosophy. Though, of course, Michael thinks that there's lots of scientifically significant, indeed, or even crucial work for philosophy to do. Right? But philosophy is bigger than metaphysics, of course. The project in Everything Must Go, of course, is to defend the idea that a naturalistic metaphysics, something that deserves the name metaphysics, is possible, and we try to make a first stab at doing it in our book. So on the surface, there certainly seems to be a disagreement on that question, but of course it's all going to hinge on what exactly one means by metaphysics. I mean, the boundary between metaphysics and epistemology is subtle and complex. So it's open to still wonder whether there is a substantive disagreement or just a kind of semantic one that we want to draw, that we understand the distinction between metaphysics and epistemology in a slightly different way. Again, what I'm going to do first is present some reasons for thinking there is a substantive difference. But then again, as I already said towards the end, we'll also offer some remarks in the event that people are unpersuaded by that and think that in fact the substantive disagreement is minor or semantic. So let me start with a shared assumption, and here this is a shared assumption then between James and I on the one hand and Michael on the others. Indeed, this is, I think, an assumption widely shared in the room. Has something to do with who we invited here today. So, first of all, that philosophy or metaphysics are valuable just insofar as they're motivated by the same objectives as science. It's part of their goal to elucidate the world for us. You can distinguish, of course, between first-order descriptions of the world and second-order aspects, second-order elucidation of what we're doing when we describe the world. But the objective is ultimately the same, to understand the world, to achieve objective understanding. Given that this is, if one holds this assumption, if this is the shared assumption, one should expect then that generalizations to which one assents, I mean, of course, generalizations are false, but endorsed generalizations about the value of philosophy / metaphysics should depend on some general beliefs about the nature of science. If you believe the first thing, you should believe the second thing. Now, in trying to reflect, now trying to ask ourselves, what is this basis that we share for evaluating proposals about what kind of philosophical activity is useful to the achievement of that shared objective? We need to decide what we mean by science. So think of these as different alternative bases for induction, reflection, elaboration. Where do our examples come from? What are our examples of this scientific activity that we use as with which philosophical activity should be consistent, continuous, part of the same project? And one could identify many ways, of course, in which this could be thought about, but we just make three distinctions here, three sets of basis, all of which could be thought of as science. So, for example, one basis where you could look for dynamics of reasoning that are just characteristic of activities that go all the way back, at least as far as the ancient Greeks. In Mark Wilson's book, he suggests that that's a very liberal conception of science. For instance, science is continuous with objective inquiry. Objective inquiry has been going on for a very long time, at least in the Western tradition. So one could then draw examples from pre-Newtonian science, for example. Alternatively, one could think that something very special happened at the scientific revolution, that the templates, post-Newtonian templates, Newtonian and subsequent templates are relevant in a special way that pre-Newtonian templates are not. So one could look for then, one could think that the basis on which one thinks about the relevance and mission of philosophy in dynamics of reasoning are characteristic activities that go back to the moment, as it were. And of course, it's a very, very smeared moment, a moment which will start before Newton's birth and finish after Newton's death. But that moment when Newton gave us what I'll say is our first complete scientific product, the little asterisk there indicates a footnote which will be on the next slide. Right? Well, what do I mean by that? Alternative, and then finally, right, one might think, no, there's something special about contemporary science. So history of science is very, very interesting, very important for understanding science, but the real basis for a scientific philosophy should be science as with the content of science as we now find it, opposed to science which is of largely historical interest. So on that, then the basis would be, go look at when you're now evaluating the sort of philosophy that is relevant and well motivated. Look for the dynamics of look to the dynamics of reasoning that are characteristic of successful science, and another footnote is coming, what we mean by successful. Successful science as it's done now.